Best introduction ever. Okay. Well, the first thing I have to do is I have to echo Stuart's earlier comments and thank you for putting up with this ignorant Yankee who does not speak your lovely language. And I have to express my appreciation for the translators who made it possible for me to listen to all the good talks that are going on today. Well, this is me, Easy Myers. You just heard it real loud. I'm a biologist at the University of Minnesota. I also blog at that site right up there, so if you want to see what I've been chatting about, you can always go there. I've also noticed that there are a number of Mexican bloggers here, and I mentioned your names to me in a few places. I would like to encourage all of you who have a blog to write down the URL and give it to me sometime, and I'd be happy to put some links up so that more people could have access to all the information that you guys have provided. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is, I kind of feel like it's going to be a bit of an anticlimax, because the last fellow who was up here gave you the entire history of the whole freaking universe. And I'm going to talk about something a little smaller. But that's okay. This is kind of like the light digestive after the heavy meal. We'll ease out of here a little more quietly. Okay, so I'm going to talk about why science and atheism are natural allies. And in particular, I'm going to talk about this, a positive atheism. That I've been running into this phenomenon over and over again, and it's really kind of driving me nuts. The latest example is this one. This is from the New York Times this week in the science section, I believe. And this is this fellow, James Gorman, and he's saying, atheism will not become a dominant world religion despite the efforts of some scientists. Which I kind of, within my lifetime, I don't expect atheism to become dominant, but I expect it to be a rather louder voice. But his reason is bogus. He says, because atheists, like certain negative prognosticators, are all about what's not. In this case, they assert God. And then he mocks the whole idea of getting together to reaffirm a lack of belief, joining hands, not praying, writing a creed about what they don't believe. I don't think so. What he's doing is merely revealing his own ignorance about atheism. Because atheism is not about simple disbelief. It really isn't. That's the message I want to get across today. I often run across this as well, the dictionary atheist. I've been in many online arguments, and people will argue about exactly what an atheist is. They'll trot out the dictionary and say, oh, atheism is just a theory or belief that God does not exist. We're done. That's it. Even where sometimes you'll get into these arguments with atheists, my own people, and they'll sit there and they'll say things like, well, there's a difference between not believing in God and not having a belief in God. And then they'll sit there and split hairs for days on end, chatting about these minor semantic differences, which I think are absolutely absurd. It's ridiculous. This isn't the basis of atheism. The basis of atheism is not disbelief. I know that sounds a little bit heretical, but it's true. We are not atheists because we don't believe in something. We are atheists because we believe in things. And we believe in these things very strongly. There are a number of kinds of atheists out there. And I want to first give you a brief taxonomy of atheists. I want to talk about the different kinds that you run into. And listening to the talks today, I've been hearing many different kinds of atheism. And all of it's valid, and all of it's great. And none of it is simple denial. All of it is based on strong beliefs. So, for instance, there are a great many people who I would call social justice atheists. Why are they atheists? It's because that they find that religion is an oppressor. Religion has done bad things throughout history. Religion doesn't provide good benefits for many people. When you look at many causes like slavery or racism or gender equality or gay rights or free speech or many others that I'm sure you can all think of, when you look at history, what you generally find is religion is on the wrong side of every one of them. Now, this is not to say that there have been no religious people who have been on the right side. Of course, there were many people, for instance, who fought against slavery, who used religious motivations. But what you generally find is that the most common interpretations of religious beliefs lead to an opposition to these sorts of civil rights principles. Right now in the United States, we're having these big battles over issues like abortion, we mentioned earlier, things like gay marriage, and uniformly, when you go to look at the opponents of these principles, who do you find? You find the religious right. So I think there's good cause to be an atheist if you are interested in justice, if you're interested in liberty. Okay, so there's plenty of examples of these. I've indulged in this myself. Some of you may know that I committed an act of desecration a while back. This is an example of fighting for social justice. What I was doing here was I was making a protest against the Catholic Church. In fact, the reason I did this specific, what you see here is, that's a communion wafer impaled on a nail, by the way. The reason I used this particular communion wafer is I was sent this by a Catholic who was very upset by the Catholic Church's policies in Africa, being against contraception, fighting sensible opposition to AIDS, so forth and so forth and so forth. And so he sent this to me. He says, send a message that we don't believe in this stuff. And so that's what I did here. This was a casual act of protest, and it's speaking out for free speech. It was mentioned earlier about blasphemy laws. Blasphemy laws have to be stopped. They have to be opposed. And I think one way to do that is to commit blasphemy. Nobody's hurt, right? So the only person who could possibly be hurt is God. And I think he's big enough to stand up for himself if he exists. But anyway, the other thing is I don't want this to be sort of, I didn't want this to be sort of anti-Catholic bashing. I didn't want to be singling out Catholics. So you may notice that in my garbage can with banana peels and the coffee grounds, I also desecrated a copy of the Koran. And the one that hurt was, I actually tore up a copy of the God Delusion. But really, this is one of the things we have to stand up for is we favor free speech. We believe that you should not be committed to any particular dogma, that we should encourage free thought. Which leads to another kind of atheist that was brought up earlier today. I know Dan Barker mentioned this. They're what I call free thought atheists. They're people who say that if you're going to make decisions about how the world works, if you want to understand the way you think, you don't do this by encouraging an authority from above to be telling you what you're supposed to think. Because then you're not thinking at all. That what free thought atheists fight for is the freedom of everybody in the culture to come to their own conclusions. That when you get right down to it, a lot of atheism is not, strictly speaking, anti-religious. We're not saying we're going to burn down the churches and we're going to hang the priests. No, what we're saying is everybody has the right to come to their own conclusions. And then we want to encourage in the public at large is a greater degree of critical thinking. Dan mentioned earlier, we're not trying to set up an atheist pope or an atheist bishop. That's not going to happen. In our perfect world, everybody's going to be thinking about this and coming to their own decisions. And if somebody of their own free will decides that they want to join the Catholic Church, let them. We're not going to stop them. So this kind of atheist is an atheist who stands for principles, and that principle is critical thinking and free thought. Another kind of atheist is this one, the historical atheist. And these are serious scholars. These are people who do this, who take religion seriously, who take the claims of theologians as something that's worth investigating. And they investigate them carefully, and what they discover is that the Bible is bullshit. and so, you find all these inconsistencies and errors, and that's a good reason to be an atheist, because the scholarship says so. that there's no good reason to accept the truth of biblical dogma. This diagram over here that you can't see because it's so very, very tiny, you can find at Sam Harris's Project Reason site. What it is a diagram illustrating all of the contradictions in the Bible. So what those are, the books of the Bible listed along the horizontal axis, and down below there's all this text showing all these things that contradict one another, and the little red lines all over the place. This cloud of lines is all the lines linking Bible verses that contradict each other. So, you know, the Bible is not a reliable source of information. I also saw a very amusing comic about this week. This is Ted Rall, and he's mocking this whole idea that we have people who are trying to live their life by this old book. And as it says over there in the second panel, meanwhile, the world is falling apart. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of geeks pore over every word in a poorly edited anthology of hack writers, which is a great description of the Bible. That's what it is. It's a poorly edited anthology of hack work. It's just not very good. And it's certainly not some reason to use this to guide your life. So what many of us think is that there are better ways to live our lives. There's a positive reason to live our lives, and that is to use reason, rationality, evidence, good critical thinking, just in general, evidence-based thinking. Okay, another brand of atheist that I run into a lot, and I'm a little jealous. Cosmic atheists. I also call them Carl Sagan atheists. And these are atheists who they've got kind of an advantage over us biologists, because these are often physicists and astronomers, and what they can do is they can point their telescopes out there and they can look at the universe and they can say, wow, it's gigantic, it's immense. And when you do something like look in the heart of a star, what do you find? You find these unimaginably powerful energies all pounding away, all this power that's out there in the universe. And at the same time, they can say, look, all it takes is some simple natural laws to assemble this. That this isn't the product of some kind of super brain, some cosmic design. What this is the result of something we can understand, and that's how the universe works. And I think that leads to a realization that you don't need God. And that God is actually a piss-poor explanation for the universe, while physics tells you a heck of a lot. Like I say, I'm a little jealous because I'm a biologist, and what biologists tend to do is we get a slightly different perspective. We look at very, very tiny things, and they're very, very complicated, but the other thing we notice when we look at them is that they're very kludgy, they're very clumsy and awkward, and that they're the product of mistakes, the accumulation of errors, and a selection of slightly better performance. So we have a less grand view of the universe. Also, we're doing this while we're looking at them with our glasses and our poor feeble eyes and our aching back that's sitting there in a microscope feeling really sore. And then also lots of times, because we're biologists, we think about sex. We think about sex a lot. If you want to picture something really silly and undignified about the universe, just imagine for a moment the human sex act. It's hilarious. You know, physicists can talk about the grandeur of life, but biologists are experts at talking about the silliness of life. But all of it works together to tell us how we don't need a God to understand what's going on. Now, what we need is reason and science and evidence. Okay, I want to talk about my particular brand of atheism. And yes, like I said, there's many different ways to be an atheist. This is my way, and it's not the only way. We're called the new atheists, which annoys us no end because we're not new in the sense of N-E-W. Not brand new atheists. The kind of atheism we're talking about has been around for centuries, and so it's kind of silly to single us out and say, oh, we're doing something brand new. No, we're not. So a few people have said, no, in protest we also call ourselves the GNU, the GNU atheists, because that doesn't mean anything at all. Except it's a label. Okay, we'll accept a label. We are different from these other categories. And when you talk to new atheists, why do you find that they are atheists? It's not because they're simply denying God. It's because of, well, science. Yeah, we like that science stuff too. Science is a powerful explanation. Science really helps us understand how the world works. The other thing about the new atheists is this one. It's a little obscure, but we love stories. We are, as it says here, we're consistently committed to the power of the evidential narrative. We like to tell stories about biology, about evolution, about the history of the universe, but we like to tell stories that are true. This makes us different from the Bible thumpers right there. We like to have some evidence for why we think our stories work the way they do. We like to have good, powerful explanations that help us understand the universe. What a novel concept. The other thing is, of course, we also are pretty consistent in saying that religion and religious thinking are obstacles that must be openly opposed. We've heard some expression of that today, too. You know, in the purest sense, when you look at people like Carl Sagan, you know, those cosmic atheists I talked about, they were often quite content to just say how wonderful the universe is and how wonderful science is explaining for us. The new atheists nowadays are going a little step beyond that and they're saying, yeah, it's really wonderful, but boy, look at these morons over here that think and maybe we should say something about that and actually actively fight these forces of ignorance. But really, the new atheism is based on a positive explanation. And it's based on scientific thinking. This is the way we actually think. And I want to suggest to you 3 little pieces of the story, 3 reasons why we think the way we do. And that is, these are things that are valued under science. And one of them is the truth of biology. And the first most important truth of biology that I got to get across to you is that our brains are not very good. We really have lousy brains for doing the job we're trying to do with them. The other is, let me think, what was I going to say here? Oh yes, the obvious one, power of evidence. That we don't believe in things just because we assert them to be so. That we actually have to have a good reason to say these things. We've got to be able to support our claims. And the third one is a subtle one, and that is we really believe in asking good questions. And I tell my students when I teach biology, right? So I teach all these young students who are going to go on and take over the world of science. I tell them that the difference between being an adequate scientist, somebody who gets the job done, and being a great scientist is not techniques, it's not methodology, it's not using the scientific method. The difference is that great scientists ask really good questions. And that's a powerful tool. It's actually really hard to teach. I've been struggling to learn it myself for many years. Okay, so let me talk about each of these. So let me talk about bad brains first. And this one is really hard to get across to people because, you know, we all have functional brains, right? We've all got, I hope, we've all got good lives, and we all function adequately in our jobs, and we all get together with our families, and we can all interact with other normal human beings, and we're happy, I hope. Everything's working smoothly. So it's hard to say that we have bad brains, but we really do, because our brains don't do the jobs I want my brain to do. You know, I've got this computer here. It helps. It compensates for some of my inadequacies. But there's a lot of other things where we go wrong. Because, you know, here's what your brain evolved for. This is what your brain evolved to do. Your brain evolved to find stuff to eat. So I noticed at the start of my talk, everybody found food trade. Sitting here, and what you're doing right now is extremely unnatural. Especially if there's any more pastries left. You're being weird apes if you're not out there eating. The other thing is one we managed to successfully avoid in most cases, that's avoid getting eaten. This was a much more pressing concern when they were living in environments where there were active predators trying to kill you. We still got a little bit of a worry about that. We still have to worry about things like bacteria trying to kill you. Our brain evolved to use tools, and I think this is special about the human brain, that we are particularly well adapted to use technology. And it's really the secret of our success, is that we are using this technology. And then, of course, the other big thing, and probably the biggest purpose for our brains, is interacting socially. There's a huge amount of effort in our brains dedicated to things like speech, social communication, interacting with one another, sensing those non-spoken, those non-verbal signals between each other. All this stuff is subtle, and it's embedded in our brains. And it's probably even more important than tools, because that one is the tool we use to get laid. And that's pretty important in evolutionary biology. Remember I told you, biologists, that's all they think about is sex. That's what our brains are for, is getting us sex, which I approve of. However, we use our brains for other things. We have brains that do not evolve for shopping. Really. Go to any of the malls around here, and at least the male brain. I go to these malls and I'm baffled, I'm bewildered, I don't know what to do. Some people take naturally to it, but when you were evolving, when your species was evolving, there were no shopping malls. Somehow, we've acquired this ability. This is one that, as we get older, is very unnatural. Our brains are not used to tracking cholesterol. I'm looking at the great food at the restaurant here, and I'm thinking, oh, it tastes good, that's all that matters. And that's kind of, my brain is sitting there, churning over these facts that, oh yeah, you've got to watch your heart health and things like that, but no, my brain is also saying, good, eat. Our brains did not evolve to build space shuttles. We do amazingly complicated things that require team effort, that require advanced tools like computers, that require sophisticated education in things other than how to eat or how to avoid getting eaten. These very sophisticated, complicated things, because our brains are not ready for that. But we force them, and we succeed. And as far as the social networking stuff does, Facebook, there was no Facebook more than 10 years ago, okay? We did not evolve for this. Our children were not selected for the use of Facebook, but look at what they're doing now. It's kind of taken over their lives, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do, we were not evolved for, and our brains aren't particularly good at, but we managed to muddle through. Now, there are all these unnatural things, and this leads me to make another point that often I find in the audiences I talk to, they find rather annoying. Because most often I talk to very liberal audiences. Atheists tend not to be so conservative. They tend to be rather radical in their politics and so forth. And so when I tell them that, when you see something like this, you're looking at a genius. Okay? Compared to everything else in the animal kingdom, this guy, now some of you may not be as familiar with English, so I got to tell you the joke here. This guy says, get a brain, and he's trying to say, you morons, and he's misspelled it. Okay. So, not so bright. This is somebody, one of these Tea Party protest movements. People I have no respect for. But, look, they're using their brains in their own great ways. They are doing things that a chimpanzee could not do. Sure, give a chimpanzee a brush and a sign, and he will not make a sign quite that nice. So he's pretty smart. He's probably successful in all the ways biology cares about. He may very well have a family. He may be successful in raising children. He may be quite good at things like loving his wife, loving his children, caring for their future upbringing. It's always a mistake on our part, even as liberal, progressive, even radical sorts of political beings, to think of our opposition as somehow inferior, because they're not. They're doing things with their brains that every baboon in the universe would envy. For that matter, you guys know about Glenn Beck? Yeah. Yeah, okay. He's an extremely conservative, rather crazy person on Fox News in the United States who's constantly raving about conspiracy theories, and he'll break into tears to win emotional support of his audience and so forth. He's sickening to watch. But he's got a huge audience, and he's beloved. He is the alpha baboon of television. And I think he really represents something great. He is the pinnacle of baboon evolution. And you can't mock him for that. That's something that's really good. So here we've got brains that you know, we have all these assumptions about how our brains work. That we all, as atheists, sit around and we assume, oh, well, brains should be logical, rational, calm, that we should come to very analytical sorts of conclusions. And that's not what our brains are evolved for at all. Our brains are evolved to respond to tears in public. We think that's a powerful thing. Our brains respond to work as a group with other people, to have empathy, to work together with others, to cooperate. All of these things things our brains are really good at. So what happens is that there's a whole catalog of phenomena that emerges where our brains are not equipped to deal with them very well unless we force ourselves into these unnatural patterns of thinking logically. For instance, here's a few phenomena that you may have heard of. What you see on the left is weeping statues. And I understand they have these sorts of things in Mexico. And they have visions and things on hillsides that people say, oh, we saw the Virgin Mary. They see things in the clouds, they see things everywhere. This is perfectly natural for brains to do. This is what brains are really good at. Our brains are good at sensing patterns in nature, and if there are no nature patterns, if there's just chaos, we impose our preconceptions on them. So these are examples of things where people see something arbitrary. Well, some of them are. The one on the left is probably fraud. Again, this is social networking, though. Really, if you want to get rich, if you want to have the acclaim of your neighbors, have a miracle in your house. Invite your friends over. Oh, you must be special. This is social networking things. Some of the things, that's a little bit of fraud. But things like, there's a piece of toast with Jesus' face in it. There's a tortilla with Jesus' face. This is an office building in Florida. Apparently the sprinkler would scatter chemical residues on the windows. You get this interesting birefringent pattern on there. And it's, oh, there's the Madonna. But what are these things? I mean, we think these are fraud, and this is pareidolia. This is the ability of the mind to impose patterns on it. So one of the things we have to appreciate is brains are pretty bad, and we have to work hard to compensate for our failures. How do we compensate for the failures of our brain? Well, that's what science is all about. Then what have we done? We have invented this technique called the scientific method. And we use that to test against the biases that our brains impose on us, against other experience, against measurable phenomena, against theory. And this has been a powerful tool. I was glad to see in the last talk that there was that nice illustration of the Pillars of Hercules in the Strait of Gibraltar. Because this is actually a seminal document in the history of humankind. I think it's one of the most important documents ever published, far outstripping the Bible in its importance, but of course nobody reads this one anymore. This is the Instauratio Magna. It's from Francis Bacon. It's where he lays out the principles of the scientific method. And what I love about it too is he chose this illustration to show what it's all about. And as his illustration, he chose Pillars of Hercules. That's a very abstract illustration of what the Pillars of Hercules looks like, and ships sailing out into the unknown. And this is what science is about, is not just a logical pattern of thinking, but also encouraging boldness and courage in going out and exploring the unknown. But of course, what he also did in this book is he proposed these principles of the scientific method. I heard deduction and induction and observation and measurement and repeated observation, the importance of testing your hypotheses, that you don't just simply say, well, this must be true, therefore we're done when it's true. No, what you do is you propose a hypothesis and you say, well, that could be wrong. How could I show that it's wrong? And then you go out and use critical experimental testing to show that it was wrong. Or if it succeeds, it isn't wrong. So it's this whole incremental process that he's endorsing in this book. And really, he laid out this document that helps us understand how to think like a logical human being instead of a self-indulgent ape, which is kind of useful. Okay, in case you don't know the scientific method, I also have this little cartoon. I won't try to go over it in detail, but it's illustrating that the scientific method is something so simple a kid can do it. What this is a little cartoon to illustrate the principles of the scientific method. With this kid saying, okay, well, I've got a question, can I pick up this big rock and impress everybody by throwing it in the pond? And so what does he do? He tests it, he throws it, he shows that he actually did it, and then of course I like the part where he publishes results for peer review, says, "Woo, suckers, I totally did it." And then other people say, well, yeah, I bet you I can do it too. This is science in action. It's actually harnessing some of the illogical power of our brain, things like looking for status and so forth, and using it to come to rational conclusions. It's a really powerful tool. Here's another illustration of science and mythology, and this also highlights some of the differences in our way of thinking. That we have these stories. We've heard some of them today. Physicists will get up and tell you the story of how the universe began. And what will they do? They'll tell you things like this example on the left. It says, all the matter and energy were formed in the Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. The Earth accreted out of a protoplanetary disk of gas and dust around the sun 4.5 billion years ago. This is familiar stuff. You've heard of this, right? But when you ask physicists, how do you know this? Well, they say, well, here's some evidence. The Hubble redshift, the cosmic background radiation, radiometric dating of lunar rocks and meteorites. They can give you long lists of these things. Yes, that last talk, you heard it all. I told you I gave the entire freaking history of the universe. And what did he do? He didn't just tell you, well, this is what I made up this morning. He told you, this is why. Here's some of the evidence. On the other hand, if you go to religion, what do? You find lovely poetic stories. And the one I've got here is the Edda, the Norse Edda. He says, okay, from the formless mist emerged Ymir, the frost giant. He was suckled by the great cow at Umbla, who licked salt and hoarfrost from the ice. The god Odin slew Ymir and made the world from his corpse. His eyebrows formed the bounds of Midgard, the home of men. And what is the evidence for this? It is so written in the Eddas. I dare them to come up with actual evidence, scientific evidence for this kind of story. Again, it's a lovely story. It's very poetic. It appeals to that ape brain that isn't necessarily entirely rational, but loves stories and loves myths and loves the poetry of this sort of thing. But he's not going to come up with any evidence for this. And now I've picked on the Norse Eddas, but we could do exactly the same thing with the Christian faith or the Muslim faith or any of the other religions that purport to say something about the nature of the universe. So the bottom line is this. We compensate for the flaws and weaknesses of our brains by demanding rigor, replication, and open publication. We demand that we have some evidence for what we assert. And simply somebody else asserting something the same is not evidence. We need something we can track through and see how this is measured, how is this observed, how is this calculated. Okay, the third one, big questions. So, there are such things as really bad questions, and we all recognize them. For instance, you could ask, did the flying spaghetti monster create the universe? Is that a good question? I don't think so. It's a funny question. It sort of highlights the absurdity of many origin stories. But ultimately, this is a mocking question. This is making fun of something. It's not something we seriously propose testing. There are no astronomers who've got their telescopes aimed at the sky looking for cosmic meatballs. Okay, it's just not. We don't expect it to be there. There's no good reason to ask this question. What we generally do is when we do science, we have another tool we use, and this is a familiar tool. This is Occam's razor, which I have actually run into people saying, this is the definition of Occam's razor. The simplest answer is usually the correct one. I actually have some of my students tell me this, and I have to tell them, no, that's completely wrong, especially if you're biologists. It seems like in physics they get simple answers. Again, unfair. In biology, all we get is much more complicated questions than we ever anticipated, and it just gets harder and harder. So, you know, what Occam's razor is, though, is it's a tool. So the Occam's razor, you know, strictly spoken, is one should not increase beyond what is necessary the number of entities required to explain anything. It is not a tool for generating answers, it is a tool for generating questions. That what we want is a useful tool that will help us answer things. And when you look at something like, did the flying spaghetti monster create the universe? That violates Occam's razor because it is proposing a whole bunch of elaborate entities. And it just generates too many questions to answer. What you find in science, what we generally do is we say, okay, well, let's look at the natural universe. And what's the littlest question out there that I could possibly answer within my grant funding period? That we're very practical about this. Because inventing a colossal question that you'll never answer is not as productive as inventing a little question that you can answer and that will advance the cause of knowledge. So, like, for instance, here's a big question. This is a scientific question. How did the brain develop and evolve? And I picked this one up because like I said, I'm a biologist, and these are the questions that I'm really interested in, the gigantic questions. I'm a developmental biologist, so I'm curious about how you get from a single cell to something like a baby that actually has a rudimentarily functioning brain. And I'm also interested in big questions of evolution. How do we get a human brain out of all those primate ancestors, and before that the fish ancestors, and before that single cell organisms? How do we get all that complexity evolving? But you know, I would admit right off the bat that no, this is too big a question to ask. This is not, in a sense, a good question. It's a gigantic question, but what we have to do is narrow it down. And what that means is that in order to answer this question, you have to study all these things. So any of you who are young students thinking about a career in developmental biology or neuroscience or evolution, I just tell you, go to school right now and take classes in all of these things, and you'll be this far along towards answering the big question. Then what we do is we break it down into smaller questions. So for instance, I am a cell biologist and a molecular biologist, and I study genetics and embryology, and also a little neurobiology. And what I do in my own research is I ask very small questions. Again, remember I mentioned earlier, astronomers look at the big stuff, we look at the teeny tiny stuff. And in my own interest, what I do is I look at single cells. I look at a single cell in a developing embryo and I ask, what does it do? How does it make up its mind? What kind of molecular signals are involved in getting that neuron to its eventual fate? And I think this is what we do as scientists. And I think it's also what we do as atheists. We ask smaller questions. What does God do for our life right now? And he doesn't seem to do much, does he? You know, does prayer work? No, it doesn't seem to. It doesn't seem to help much at all. Then what we do is instead of asking that big question, we ask all these little practical questions. How does God get me through my life? And for some people, it makes them feel good about themselves, and that's a pretty intangible and unimportant reason to be believing in something as cosmic as a super being that rules the entire universe and is very concerned about what you do with your genitals. Like I said, biologists always think about it. Okay, so another big question, does God exist? Oh man, that's gigantic. It's huge, right? If there really were a God, if he is the God of Christianity, he's immense. And that's somewhere where you can't dig in very deeply. So one of the things we have to do is we have to narrow this down to smaller questions. And what we've found is if you talk to theologians, even their little questions are bad questions. You know, that old medieval question of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, that's a stupid question. You don't even have a way of answering that. So, you know, I actually wrote up a little piece on my blog a while back to talk about this, and I offered a little parable for the folly of religious explanations, and I'm going to play it for you. And I know you're all disappointed because Richard Dawkins isn't here. I'm sorry. Maybe next year. Maybe some other time we get Richard Dawkins here. But I've got Richard Dawkins reading it. So you'll at least get to hear Richard Dawkins' voice. And also, most importantly for my ego, is he says nice things about me at the beginning. But anyway, this is this little story I wrote about the silliness of many theological explanations. Let's hope it works. I'm just going to put my microphone down there, and this better work.
This is the courtier's reply, written by the magnificent P.Z. Myers, who's one of the scientific blogger. And he's writing about the criticism that people don't talk about theology books. I have considered the impudent accusations of Mr. Dawkins with exasperation at his lack of serious scholarship. He has apparently not read the detailed discourses of Count Rodrigo of Seville on the exquisite and exotic leathers of the emperor's boots. Nor does he give a moment's consideration to Bellini's masterwork on the luminescence of the emperor's feathered hat. We have entire schools dedicated to writing learned treatises on the beauty of the emperor's raiment, and every major newspaper runs a section dedicated to imperial fashion. Dawkins cavalierly dismisses them all. He even laughs at the highly popular and most persuasive arguments of his fellow countryman, Lord D.T. Walkscribbler, who famously pointed out that the emperor would not wear common cotton nor uncomfortable polyester, but must, I say must, wear undergarments of the finest silk. Dawkins arrogantly ignores all these deep philosophical ponderings to crudely accuse the emperor of nudity. Personally, I suspect that perhaps the emperor might not be fully clothed. How else to explain the apparent sloth of the staff at the palace laundry? But, well, everyone else does seem to go on about his clothes, and this Dawkins fellow is such a rude upstart who lacks the wit of my elegant circumlocutions, that while unable to deal with the substance of his accusations, I should at least chide him for his very bad form. Until Dawkins has trained in the shops of Paris and Milan, until he has learned to tell the difference between a ruffled flounce and a puffy pantaloon, we should all pretend he has not spoken out against the emperor's taste. His training in biology may give him the ability to recognize dangling genitalia when he sees it, but it has not taught him the proper appreciation of imaginary fabrics.
Okay, the point, of course, is that if you look at theology, you find all these very peculiar assertions about the nature of the deity, which, they never get around to the substance. They never ask the important questions. They never ask questions that we can answer. They invent these most amazing, elaborate rituals and bits of dogma. But where is the story? Where is the evidence? Where are the facts? So, there's lots of questions we could ask, like how many gods exist? Where is the discussion of that? We have this flat assertion from the Catholic Church, for instance, there's one. But then who's this Mary person? Who's this Jesus person? Who's the Holy Ghost? What about all these saints? They all seem to be like little gods. Are we really going to say there's just one, or three, or an innumerable horde of gods? I don't know. And is he in one part or three? And this has been a major question in Christian history. People have been slain over this. There have been wars fought over this issue. Entire tribes were annihilated because they gave the wrong answer to this. And I don't see that they've shown their work to show me how they know the right answer. Okay, which of his holy chosen people get Palestine? This is a pressing question. You may have noticed, there's Jews, there's Christians, and there's Muslims over there. And they all say it's not theirs, and that they are God's precious, holy chosen people. How do we resolve that? Especially if you've got a group of people who refuse to show you evidence for their claim, other than waving a Bible at you And the Bible is not particularly persuasive. Another one, does God really hate fags? You know, we have this Christian group in the United States, and they go around waving these signs and they say, God hates fags, God hates fags. It's all over the place. And, you know, why should I believe them? They seem a little loony. Again, they won't show their work. They'll cite Bible verses. And, yeah, why should I believe the Bible? There's a big question that scientists are used to asking, and that the religious are not. And this is an important question, and it's really simple. How do you know that? You know, any of the speakers today who talked about science, you could have raised your hand at any point. You could have asked them, how do you know that's true? Okay, how do you know that Pluto's up there? How do you know that Saturn has rings? How do you know that Newton's laws apply? And, you know, if you wanted to spend an hour or two longer here, they could have told you in great detail everything we know about that. They could have explained this to you. And it wouldn't just be them making up a bunch more stories. They would be citing things in the scientific literature. They'd be showing you experiments. They'd be showing you photographs taken through telescopes. All of this could be documented. Try going to church. And, you know, when the priest says, you know, all you have to do is believe in Jesus and you will be saved. Raise your hand and say, how do you know that? And I bet you won't be able to answer. At least not to any rational person's satisfaction. And this has been a problem throughout religious history, is that, you know, you could ask lots of questions like this. That, you know, there's this whole business of the Trinity we just mentioned. How do we know that? Well, it turns out we know that because the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD said so. And if you look at the historical records, what you discover is that the Council of Nicaea, they were not doing experiments. They didn't pin down God's essence and examine it in a theoscope or whatever. What it was a committee of bishops, and they sat down, they said, oh, well, we look at this holy book, and I think it means this, and I think it means this other thing. And they argued with each other, and they came to a conclusion. But no, they couldn't show you their work. They couldn't show you any experiments. How about this whole business of transubstantiation? That holy wafer, it's supposed to turn into the body of Jesus? Wow, that's impressive. Again, when you go and look at the records and ask how they figured this out, they declared it so. Fourth Council of Lateran, 1215 AD. Again, a bunch of bishops get together, and the Pope, and they sit down and they write things down. They say, well, this is the way it is, because we said it so. But again, no experimental theologians. They're just not there. What about this one? Papal infallibility. 1870. First Vatican Council, the Pope says so. I wish I could do that. P.Z. Myers is infallible. How do we know? Because I said so. And remember, I'm infallible. How about a big one? Look at Jesus. There is no primary source for Jesus. Jesus does not fit any kind of standard of the historical literature. There are only second and third hand descriptions of this guy, and many of them we can see that they're fables retold. Jesus is legend. He's not history. Why do we accept that? And it's not just Christianity. Ask any faith. Go to any religious faith that you can think of. Go to the Buddhists, go to the Muslims, go to the Hindus. Ask about afterlife, karma, reincarnation, redemption. There's no source evidence for any of this. It's just stuff that they wish were true. Which is nice, I suppose. I wish I could live forever. I wish $1 million would drop out of the sky in my hands. That doesn't make it real. We have higher standards as scientists and rational beings. So what do? You know, as atheists, what we do is we get out, and as militant atheists, we get out and we say these ferocious things. Like here's a beautiful example. Wow, isn't that scary? It just makes you tremble in your bed, doesn't it? There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Isn't that ferocious? This is the kind of thing atheists do. I think it's great, especially since the reaction, especially in the United States, we put these things up, buses gone around, billboards have gone up with innocuous statements like this, and people get furious, they get upset that we have dared to suggest that maybe, probably, okay, sort of, we don't think there's a God. And it's gotten kind of silly. It's gotten very absurd that we're pussyfooting around this. And so I'm proposing a new slogan. This is my preferred slogan. There's probably no God. Now shut up and don't be so bloody deaf. It's time to move on. And these are really silly questions that people are asking. And the answer is, no, it doesn't matter until you can come up with some real evidence, until you can come up with something that meets some kind of standard of rigor for your belief. We ought to be dismissing this stuff out of hand. So let me just wind up by giving you the one magic word that is really important to us as atheists. That there's one thing that we're really valuing above all others, and that's this simple thing of truth. Now I show you a picture of a zebrafish embryo with its various neurons highlighted, just to show you that the astronomers don't have a lock on beautiful things. We also have very pretty elaborate stuff in biology that I can show you. But the main message though is when we want to understand how something works, what we want is the truth. We want to get at the actual physical, natural truth of things. And that's the most important thing in the world to us. That you may tell us that it would be nice to believe in an afterlife, and that when grandma dies, she'll go to heaven. But, when people told me that when my grandmother died, I just said, but I don't believe in fairy tales. But I want to know what's really happened. And truth is the key thing. Let me just end this now with one more quote. Now, I opened this with a quote from the New York Times, which I said was pretty bad. This whole thing that atheism is just a negative belief, a disbelief, when I'm trying to tell you it's a whole bunch of positive beliefs. And so this is just to say that the New York Times does sometimes say things that are sensible. This is another quote. We're here, we don't believe, and we've got science and reason on our side. Get used to it. No, it's a good quote because I said it. Infallible, remember? Okay, thank you.
¿Preguntas? You can use this one. Yeah, this one.
Oh yeah. So suppose you're discussing with a theist or whatever about God, and he just asks you, "How do you know there is no God?"
I would say, that truth word is really important, and I would say I don't know for sure that what I have is an absence of evidence for this magical being that you say exists, and that if you want me to believe in that, which is it not working? Okay, so I would be honest and say you're right. I do not know that for sure, but what I do know is that you haven't given me evidence for your interpretation of this magical being, and I also know a great deal about science. And science is a powerful tool that explains many of the phenomena in the universe that once upon a time people needed supernatural beings to explain. We don't invoke God or Thor or anything to explain thunder anymore. And if you know your physics and if you know your biology, we don't invoke deities to explain evolution. We don't invoke deities to explain the origin of the universe. So yeah, if I was sitting with such a hypothetical theist, and I have actually, I'd tell him, make your case, show me the evidence.
Thanks for this amazing talk. It was really great.
Thank you.
I just have one little problem with that last slide, because you use the word truth, and I have a problem with that, because scientific knowledge, scientific theories, change through history. And if they were truths, they wouldn't change. So I personally prefer to use the expression reliable knowledge, because if we use the word truth, we are liable to being accused of lying, because sometimes scientific theories change.
Yes.
So what's your position about that?
And I would agree with you that this is not truth with a capital T. This is not an absolute, immutable truth. This is our understanding of truth. That what science is a process that works by approximation to get closer and closer to the truth. I would also say that that much of what we have as truth is a body of facts that are not going to be changed. That yes, there are theoretical changes that affect or influence our interpretation of the evidence, but the evidence doesn't go away. Best example for this is evolution. Evolution is a fact. It's an absolute fact. The fact that organisms have changed over time, that the Earth shows a history of change in the distribution of life on the planet, that's an absolute fact. That's not going to change, and I don't care what the creationists say. There could be a better theory than Darwin's coming along, and I agree entirely that there could be a better theory, but that theory will explain all the existing phenomena plus other phenomena. It will not be an overthrow of evolutionary theory. It will be an expansion and improvement upon evolutionary theory. Another great example from history is Newtonian physics. When Einstein came along, that didn't mean that Newton had been wrong. What it meant was that Newton was describing a subset of physical phenomena, and Einstein's theories do a better job of explaining a wider set of them, but it still incorporates Newton's laws as approximations to them. So that's what I would say to such a person is, yeah, we've got an approximation of truth. It's pretty close. It'll probably get better. We actually have this optimistic expectation that science will improve our understanding of the universe, which is a great positive thing as well. But we're still dealing with actual facts and evidence and reasonable conclusions that religion opposes. And we can, with confidence, say that religion is wrong. The Earth is not 6,000 years old, for instance, if that's your specific interpretation.
I was wondering if you have any good suggestion about what can we do? We, in the general sense of people that tries to write blogs or tries to attend to this kind of meetings. In your experience, what suggestions would you give us that we should try to do when we wrote a blog, an article on a blog, or when we present something in this kind of form?
So you're talking about tactical or strategic suggestions?
I'm not sure if it's tactical or strategic. More like what in your experience do you think attracts people to read your blog, for example?
Oh, being a big jerk really helps. Okay. Annoying people is helpful. But no, seriously, one thing that's really helpful is to be forthright and honest. That that we have more than enough people in society right now who will hedge and hem and haw and kind of edge around and avoid annoying religious people. And having a few people who are willing to just stand up boldly and say you're wrong is powerful. And especially if you do more than that. We don't want to fall into that theistic trap of just making assertions. But you say, you're wrong, and here's why, and here's the list. That's powerful stuff. People like to see conflict, and they like to see conflict resolved. And they will have a lively discussion with you, even if they disagree with you, as long as you've given them something to argue over. And I think that's a powerful tool. And if you read my blog, you look at the comments, what you find is there's people arguing non-stop, sometimes a little too ferocious and bloodthirsty for my taste even. But yeah, that give and take of an open discussion is a powerful tool for drawing people in.
Hi. A friend of mine who is a molecular biologist, he made a remark about biology. He told me that he'd rather have people believe in intelligent design, sort of like a step towards later believing in evolution, because it helps investigation. And I think there's a widespread kind of like flavors that people, some scientists want to follow that strategy.
Right. Yeah, and so this is another one of those tactical debates that's going on within the evolutionary biology community all the time. And that is, which is more effective? Is it for us to be really outspoken and risk alienating religious people? Or is it to offer little stepping stones that will lead them gradually? They say, well, okay, maybe God created the universe and used evolution as his tool to create human beings, which is something that the Catholic Church officially supports as part of their dogma. And to be honest, I think that we need all of it. That there are people who will be drawn away from dogmatic faith if you give them just let them take an inch. Don't expect them to walk a whole mile. Just say, okay, come this far with me. That works for a lot of people. But then also, I think there's a lot to say for at least having some of us going whole hog and saying, no, it's all wrong. That theism stuff, it's not true. There's no evidence for God. We want you to come the whole mile. Because one thing about that view is it's entirely honest. We're not, when we say, if you come an inch, you'll start on the path, that's basically saying eventually you'll get to our position, but we're going to hide the conclusion of our argument from you. Just take that first step. And like I said, truth is really important, honesty, openness. I would rather tell somebody, yeah, if you follow this path, if you get into science, and if you really understand what we're talking about, you're going to realize that God did not play a role in your creation. I'd rather scare them off early than later. After they've made some major career decisions, and then they suddenly go, wait, this is going to make me give up everything. There's a famous creationist in the United States named Kurt Wise, who was one of Stephen Jay Gould's graduate students. So he actually has really good training in paleontology. He understands evolution very well. And he's written about this. He's a Christian, a very devout Christian. And as he was reaching the end of his graduate career, he realized evolution shows that chance dominates the universe, that there was no divine plan. And it hurt him. Honestly, people do feel deeply about their faith. And so what he did is he went through the Bible and he said, okay, if I go through this Bible and snip out everything that science would tell me is wrong, what's left? And he discovered that his Bible was in tatters afterwards. There was nothing left. And he made a conscious decision that he would do science and go to work at a little Christian college and teach the truth as he knew it, but that he would not accept evolutionary biology. He's kind of a very honest creationist. I can respect him for that. He's made a conscious decision. But that's the way it is. If you accept science and evidence and logical reasoning, I'm sorry, there's no room left for God at the end of that path. And let's be honest about that.
Dr. Mines, getting profit that you are here, a well-known biologist. I was wondering what is the current knowledge about the origin of life? How the process?
How close are we to understanding the origin of life? Not very. There are multiple competing theories out there, and that's really where it is. It's a lot of theories. That, for instance, there's a school of thought that metabolism came first, that what we got was self-sustaining chemical reactions. There's another school of thought that says, oh, well, there had to be some kind of information storage for perpetuation of the code. And so they're thinking RNA early on and so forth. And they're kind of arguing with one another. The way most of this work is being done is there's a little bit of empirical evidence being derived. you can do things like analyze fossil strata for traces, biological traces. And basically what you're finding there is carbon films and looking at the distribution of stereoisomers as an indication of what was there. It's pretty thin stuff, it's very hard. The other thing is that they're doing experimental work where you try to recreate the conditions of the primitive bird. What we do know is that there are many phenomena that can be adequately described biochemically. Life is chemistry, right? It's all biochemistry. And bits and pieces of the story look like they're emerging out of these studies, but we don't have an integrated whole yet. There's going to be another big revolution in biology someday when we work out this complete detail. But a lot of it right now is optimism and fragments of evidence. I wish we knew more.
Well, I really can't help to ask you about Frank Collins. What do you think about it?
Francis Collins.
Francis Collins.
Yes. Oh boy. Francis Collins is an odd duck, okay? He's a very esteemed scientist. He's one of the people who worked on the Human Genome Project. He's been involved in a number of sequencing projects before that. And I would not challenge him on his competence as a scientist. And in particular, I would not challenge him on his competence as a bureaucrat. He is a master of NIH and the arcana of working through governmental red tape and so forth. And in that sense, he's an excellent choice to be head of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And lately, he's actually been doing some good work, fighting hard for improving stem cell research. So that's on the plus side of the ledger. Okay, that's stuff I like about him. On the other hand, he's a crazy Christian. He really is. And his statements about religion are embarrassing in their ignorance. He's got this whole book, The Language of God, that when he's talking about science, for instance, he's got long sections where he's talking about intelligent design creationism, and he's excellent at taking it apart. And it's really good, and you're saying, oh, this is a smart guy, he's doing great stuff. And then he gets to the part where he says, oh, I saw a waterfall in 3 parts and immediately accepted the Trinity. And you wonder what went wrong with his brain. It's like this massive short circuit. All of a sudden he's drawing these really illogical, irrational conclusions from trivial evidence. It's that pareidolia stuff again, all at work. So, in some ways I kind of like him because he is doing good work as an administrator in the NIH. And he's also doing a marvelous job of showing how stupid religion is. And when I look at, he's got he's not working on this site now, he's actually turned over the reins to somebody else. But BioLogos is his website, and it's just this amazing collection of foolish stories. It's what I read for laughs at night, So yeah, and somebody, who was it mentioned this earlier? Oh, Stuart mentioned this earlier, that it's always a mistake to think of these people as stupid. But there are great minds who are working in science who are also very devout, very religious. And I think Francis Collins is a great example of that. He's a smart guy, he's got a good mind, he's learned a lot of things, he's very well educated. It's just in this one little area, he's nuts. And I think that's true for all of us, of course. There's probably, maybe there's a few things I'm crazy about, but except for that infallibility thing, which kind of confutes that. But if people ask me about cephalopods, and there's this sudden orgasm of interest, and my eyes light up, then you might say, well, there's another example of a crazy scientist.
So that concludes our session for answering questions.
Thank you all.
Vamos a tener un cambio, vamos a tener solamente 1 hora.